I remember the minus 10 degrees Celsius perfectly. It was a physical punch. 1 minute, I was standing inside the heated back patio, arguing with my father, Daniel, about my failed startup. The next, he was smiling at his guests through the window, pushing me out, and the deadbolt clicked. I was wearing only a thin sweater. Through the frosted glass, I saw the 12-foot tree and the warm glow of the Christmas Eve dinner. I pounded, but the laughter swallowed my voice. My fingers went numb. That's when the bright lights cut through the snow. A black limousine, slow and silent, pulled up the driveway, and a woman in a dark coat, whom I knew was supposed to be dead for 3 years, stepped out. Eleanor Kingsley. The feeling I remember most wasn't anger. It was the absolute, crushing weight of the cold. I am Aaliyah Perez, 26 years old, and on Christmas Eve, I was standing on the vast, snow-covered patio behind my family's suburban mansion, wrapped in nothing but a thin burgundy cashmere sweater. The air temperature, according to the digital thermometer by the pool, was minus 10 degrees Celsius. My breath wasn't just steam, it was a thick, desperate cloud, announcing how fast my core heat was vanishing. The conversation that led to this was classic Daniel, my father, always the patriarch, the self-made king of his own gilded cage. We were near the massive kitchen island, just out of sight of the official dining room where the guests were arriving. I had just flown home, my tail tucked firmly between my legs, after the definitive, crushing collapse of my cybersecurity startup, Cipher Nest. It wasn't the failure that hurt, it was the betrayal, the sudden, inexplicable withdrawal of key investors. I was telling him, honestly, how I planned to restructure, how I needed to find out who had leaked my core algorithm. That's when he struck. He patted my shoulder with the casual, condescending air he reserved for employees who disappointed him. "Sweetheart," he'd said, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear, but too low for the arriving guests to catch. "You need to understand something. Some people are meant to create, others are meant to clean up the mess. You're a cleanup person. Now, why don't you get some air and think about that before you embarrass the family with your sob story?" I snapped. After years of biting my tongue, after months of working 18-hour days, the words were out before I could stop them. "That's not air, Dad. That's a verbal kneecapping. And if you think I'm going to spend Christmas listening to you tell me I'm disposable, you can—" He didn't need to hear the rest. His smile, aimed at the incoming guests, a CEO and his wife, a couple of hedge fund managers, was instantaneous and flawless, the kind you see on the cover of Forbes. He turned back to me, his eyes flat, devoid of warmth. Before I could process the shift, his hand was on my back, guiding me with chilling, firm precision toward the French doors leading to the patio. "Enjoy the air, Aaliyah. Think about humility." The door opened, letting in a blast of bitter cold. I stumbled out onto the freezing, snow-dusted slate. The heavy glass door swung shut with a muffled thud. Then came the small, definite click of the deadbolt. He hadn't just shut me out. He had locked me out. It was his signature move, controlling the environment, controlling me. I pressed my face against the glass, the sudden warmth from my skin melting the frost into a temporary peephole. The scene inside was an advertisement for American Christmas wealth. The dining room was bathed in the kind of deep, rich amber light that only expensive dimmers can produce. The 12-foot Norway spruce shimmered with vintage ornaments and micro-LED lights. The table was set with crystal, silver, and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. I saw Daniel. He had his back to me, his stance expansive, holding a Waterford glass filled with something dark and expensive. He was laughing, a hearty, booming sound that easily drowned out the soft jazz playing in the background. My stepmother, Miranda, a shimmering vision in a deep emerald dress, was hanging on his arm, her perfect smile broadcasting pure, uncontaminated joy. Her daughter, Chloe, my stepsister, 2 years my junior, was already seated at the table, her blonde hair catching the candlelight as she adjusted the new designer handbag Daniel must have bought her. They were a family. I was a stain they had wiped off the glass. I pounded on the thick glass, not violently, not hysterically, but with the measured desperation of someone trying to signal a distress call. "Dad, Daniel, open the door. It's too cold." The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, it all swallowed my voice whole. I watched as Daniel leaned closer to the CEO, telling a joke, waving his hands animatedly. He never once glanced toward the back door. He knew I was there. He knew the temperature. And he chose not to acknowledge my existence, treating me like a bad smell that the expensive air filtration system was working to eliminate. The cold was no longer just discomfort. It was evolving into an enemy. First, it was the shock, the immediate, sharp needles pricking my exposed skin. Now, it was a dull, heavy ache settling deep in my bones. My fingertips, which I had uselessly pressed against the frozen slate, were a waxy white. My breathing became shallow, not just from the cold, but from a burgeoning panic. I tried to curl into a fetal position near the wall, seeking shelter where none existed. Hypothermia. The word flashed in my mind, clinical and terrifying. I, Aaliyah Perez, could actually freeze to death on the custom-laid flagstone patio of my childhood home. It was such a dramatic, absurd, and completely preventable death, and it was happening because my father wanted to teach me a lesson about humility. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, sharper than the cold air. I felt the edge of consciousness begin to blur, my limbs heavy, slow, and unresponsive. And then, the light. It wasn't the gentle glow of the house. It was an aggressive, blinding slash of white, cutting across the swirling snow and the blackness of the night. A vehicle was slowly, deliberately ascending the long, winding drive. It was a black limousine, enormous and gleaming, its silhouette against the snow looking less like transport and more like a mobile steel coffin. It moved with a sense of purpose that felt entirely out of place for a casual Christmas drop-in. It stopped right on the edge of the patio, its engine idling with a low, predatory hum. The front windows were tinted completely black. The driver, a shadow in a cap, didn't move. Instead, the rear door on the passenger side, the one nearest to me, swung open with a silent, hydraulic sigh. A woman stepped out. She was tall, even in the heavy, ankle-length coat of dark gray cashmere she wore. She was wearing stilettos, sharp, impossible heels that crunched the freshly fallen snow without a hint of instability. Her posture was ramrod straight, defying the paralyzing cold. She looked like a general inspecting a front line, not a guest at a holiday dinner. The powerful headlights of the limousine framed her, and I felt the last vestiges of my fear of freezing replaced by pure, visceral shock. The angular cut of her cheekbones, the severe dark hair pulled back into an elegant knot, the set of her mouth. It was unmistakable. Eleanor Kingsley. My maternal grandmother, the billionaire founder of Kingsley Holdings, the woman who had been declared dead from a stroke in Zurich 3 years ago, complete with a massive, exclusive funeral, the reading of the will, and an internationally certified death certificate. I had cried at that funeral. Daniel had given the eulogy, an emotional performance about the ending of an era. She looked at me, shivering and pathetic, pressed against the cold glass. Her eyes, which always reminded me of polished river stones, dark and complex, didn't hold pity. They held assessment. Then, her gaze shifted, piercing the frosted window pane, landing directly on Daniel's silhouette as he raised his glass in a toast. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in that flicker, I understood everything about the woman who had just faked her own death. She turned away from the house, the harsh light casting a long, skeletal shadow. She spoke softly, yet the words seemed to travel through the soundproofing, through the glass, straight into my frozen mind. She was addressing the two figures, tall, impeccably dressed men, who had emerged from the shadows near the garage. Security? Lawyers? "Start the operation," Eleanor ordered, her voice low, precise, and utterly devoid of Christmas cheer. "The king is currently distracted. We take the castle now. The game was not just about survival anymore. The game had changed, and the temperature inside the house was about to drop far lower than -10 degrees Celsius. The sight of Eleanor, her posture a defiant exclamation point against the swirling white snow, ripped me out of the immediate pain. I wasn't just cold anymore. I was a memory, a collection of past failures and manufactured guilt, all culminating in this absurd moment. I needed to understand how I had arrived at 26 years old, a supposed high achiever, only to be locked out of my own home like a stray dog. Daniel wasn't just my father, he was the living thermostat of this house. His emotional state dictated the ambient temperature, both literally and figuratively. If he was in a good mood, the house was warm, the lighting soft, the air forgiving. If he was bored, disappointed, or, God forbid, challenged, the atmosphere would turn arctic, forcing everyone to tread lightly, conserving emotional energy just to survive the freeze. He was a master of non-physical coercion, the kind that leaves no bruises, only deep, internal scars. His punishments were never slaps or shouts. They were controlled deprivations. When I got a B+ in AP Calculus my senior year, a 91%, he didn't ground me. He simply disabled the thermostat for my bedroom, forcing me to sleep through January in a room that rarely rose above 12 degrees Celsius, all because I had lacked focus. Another time, because I forgot to turn off the antique vanity light in the downstairs powder room. He had the electrician cut the power to my bathroom for an entire week, a deliberate exercise in inconvenience and shame. His most chilling move came when I requested a new, more secure lock on my door after Miranda moved in. He saw it as ungrateful demands for privacy, and his response was to remove the door entirely for 72 hours, declaring, "You don't deserve boundaries until you learn respect." He didn't need physical violence. He controlled the infrastructure. If Daniel was the thermostat, Miranda, his new wife, was the decorator of the resulting perfection. She was the queen of social media aesthetics, utterly obsessed with the visual narrative of the perfect blended family. Every Christmas was a meticulously managed photo shoot. The matching jewel-toned outfits, the perfectly arranged table settings, the gold-filtered light. I was merely a prop, required to hit my marks. A smile that didn't crease my forehead. A laugh directed at Daniel. Eyes that conveyed quiet, appreciative subordination. If my expression was too genuine, too melancholic, or heaven forbid, too tired, she would hiss at me under her breath to "Fix your face, Aaliyah, you're ruining the shot." And then there was Chloe, Miranda's daughter, barely 24, all honey blonde hair and wide, innocent, doe eyes that could switch to calculating malice in a split second. She was a theatrical genius, constantly vying for Daniel's favor. Her favorite tactic was subtle sabotage and then playing the immaculate, helpful saint. She would steal my smaller accomplishments, a clever turn of phrase in an email, a suggestion for a charity drive, and present them to Daniel as her own brilliant insights. She was constantly rewarded for making me look bad. My entire youth felt like a perpetual, unspoken competition between Chloe and me, with Daniel as the sole, capricious judge, bonuses, trips to the Bahamas, extravagant gifts. They weren't awarded based on merit. They were awarded based on who could maintain the appearance of perfection while ensuring Aaliyah looked slightly more flawed. When Chloe spilled wine on the Persian rug, Daniel laughed it off as spirited youth. When I once forgot to organize his tax documents correctly, he called me scatterbrained and unreliable, a character assessment that still echoed in my ears. It was this constant need for perfection that drove me to Cipher Nest. I thought if I built something truly mine, something worth millions, or even billions, of dollars, Daniel would finally have to acknowledge me as an equal, a success in my own right. That narrative, that desperate craving for his approval, had been the fuel for 8 years of my life. My only tether to a saner reality had been Eleanor. I only saw her a few times a year. My favorite memory was a quiet lunch at Kingsley Manor when I was 17, right before I went to college. The place was vast, cold, and beautiful, like a mausoleum for good taste. We ate in near silence. Just as I was about to leave, she stopped me, her fingers resting lightly on the silver salt shaker. "Aaliyah," she'd said, her voice gravelly but precise, the only sound in the huge room. "I only have one rule for you in life. It's not about men or money. It's this. Never sign anything you haven't read to the last, smallest clause. Everything is a negotiation, even if you don't know it yet." I treasured that single, simple line. It was the only genuinely useful piece of advice I ever received from anyone in my family. A small, solid pebble of wisdom in a sea of emotional quicksand. For so long, I believed I was the problem. A 98% on a final exam was always met with, "Why didn't you get the other 2%? A national merit scholarship was dismissed as just a footnote. Daniel had expertly deflated every tiny bubble of joy or pride I managed to create, replacing it with the insidious, deep-seated belief that I had to be flawless to deserve to exist, or at least to deserve his minimal effort of affection. And then, 3 years ago, the performance of the century, Eleanor's death. The news came while I was in the middle of securing CipherNest's initial funding. Everything about the death, the sudden stroke in a high-end European clinic, the discreet online funeral, the ironclad certificates, felt engineered to be undeniable. Daniel gave that tearful, moving eulogy about my late great-mother-in-law. I cried. I cried real tears for the loss of the only person in the family who treated me like a future CEO instead of a current annoyance. Daniel, I now realize, wasn't crying. He was receiving his Oscar. Now, standing here, paralyzed by the cold, watching my dead grandmother approach in a bespoke cashmere coat, the entire foundation of my reality was shaking. If Eleanor Kingsley had the resources, the power, and the sheer audacity to successfully fake her own death, to erase herself from the grid for 3 full years, then what else in this life, in this house, was a carefully constructed lie? The rules of this mansion, the cold equations of my father's control, the entire power structure that had just left me for dead on the patio, perhaps none of it was real law. As the 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, flanking Eleanor like bodyguards for a sovereign, a flicker of something new, not warmth, but cold, pure hope, pierced the fear. The game was finally ending. And as Eleanor's eyes fixed on mine, I realized I might have just been rescued by the only person capable of truly fighting Daniel, a woman who considered death an optional retirement plan. The armored door of the limousine hissed shut, sealing out the minus 10 degrees Celsius air. I practically fell onto the leather seat. The intense warmth from the seat heating, which had been activated for high-speed use, felt like a literal burn against my already agonizingly cold skin. My lips were chapped, my nose was running, and the tears I hadn't even realized I was crying had dried into streaks of crystalline salt on my cheeks. The cabin smelled faintly of ozone, expensive leather, and something clinical, like surgical steel. It was a bunker. Eleanor Kingsley did not rush toward me with a grandmotherly embrace or the kind of clucking concern one might expect. She simply reached into a compartment and retrieved an item, a heavy, olive-green wool coat, thick enough for a mountain climb. She didn't hand it to me. She threw it, the fabric landing with a surprising weight on my lap. "Put it on, Aaliyah," she commanded, her voice not loud, but carrying the unquestionable authority of someone who deals in facts, not sentiment. Dying of hypothermia is the most idiotic death there is. It's preventable. Act on the data you've been given. I struggled with the coat, my fingers still clumsy and numb. Under the limo's soft, directional lighting, I saw Eleanor clearly for the first time in 3 years. She looked less like a resurrected relative and more like the CEO of a hostile takeover firm. Her charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, the cut as sharp as a blade. Her jewelry was minimal, a single, massive diamond stud in each ear, and an antique gold watch. Her gaze wasn't fixed on me, her almost frozen grandchild. It was fixed through me, as though she were reviewing an overdue financial statement. He wanted me to learn respect, I managed to stammer out, my voice still thick and shaking. The absurd defense mechanism of a lifetime of conditioning kicked in. I still felt the need to rationalize Daniel's cruelty. He thinks I need to be put in my place after the startup failed. Eleanor let out a single, dry, contemptuous laugh. It was not a sound of amusement. Respect, she repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands, clasped together, on her knee. Men like Daniel do not punish action. Aaliyah, they don't care about a failed pitch deck or a poor grade. They punish nature. They punish the core qualities in you that they see as a threat to their own small kingdom. She gestured toward the heavily tinted window that faced the house. With a quiet press of a button, the glass almost became transparent, though the view of the dining room inside was flattened and dark, like observing a crime scene through surveillance footage. There was Daniel, his head thrown back, laughing, a golden god presiding over his feast. There was Miranda, playing the perfectly supportive wife, her smile wide and slightly too fixed. And there was Chloe, preening, showing off that new designer bag, seated exactly where the daughter of the house, should have been. "Look at them," Eleanor instructed. "What do you see?" "They're celebrating," I whispered. "Celebrating the loss, the failure, the fact that I'm not there to disrupt their narrative." "No," Eleanor corrected, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "They are consuming, and you are not their burden. Aaliyah, you are their fuel." The word hit me harder than the cold ever could. Fuel. She elaborated, precisely, clinically. "Daniel is incompetent. He always has been. He coasted through life on borrowed charm and the promise of kingly wealth, but to maintain the illusion of power, he needs an energy source. He needs someone to sacrifice. He burns your self-esteem, your ambition, your potential future, your very soul, to keep his fragile ego warm." I reacted reflexively, defensively. I started cataloging my efforts, trying to justify my own existence to this woman who didn't seem to feel or fear anything. But I tried everything. I went to the college he chose, not the one I wanted. I wore the right brands Miranda forced on me. I let Chloe take credit for my 40-page history thesis because it kept the peace. I tolerated years of insults, all just for a moment, a single flash of his genuine approval. I felt the desperation of the past 2 decades welling up. Eleanor watched me, utterly unmoved. "And what did you get?" "Humiliation," I admitted, the word tasting like ash. "Always humiliation." "Exactly, because Daniel Lawson does not want you to succeed completely. He does not want you to be the CEO of a company valued at hundreds of millions, because if you had that money, that power, that validation, he would lose his victim. He would lose the source of his narcissistic supply, and worse, he would lose the justification he has built his entire life on, that he is the great, powerful savior who always knows best." She was dissecting him, not with emotion, but with the ruthless logic of a predator analyzing prey. It was a terrifying, liberating insight. He hadn't been testing my resilience. He was actively managing my failure to ensure his own survival. "He didn't lock you out tonight because you disrespected him. Aaliyah, he locked you out because your failure, your honest, crushing failure, still didn't satisfy him. You still had fight left. He needed to push you until you believed you deserved to be discarded." I looked back at the house, no longer seeing a family celebrating, but actors performing a carefully scripted scene for the benefit of a broken man. Daniel was center stage, still unaware his audience had changed. Eleanor tapped her perfectly manicured nail on the thick window glass, drawing my attention to the dark exterior. "Do you think he's wondering where you are? Is he shivering with guilt over the cold? No, he is basking in his role as king of the dinner table, the undisputed authority. That man," she said, her voice dropping to a final, deadly cold whisper, "is enjoying the feeling of absolute control tonight. Fortunately, We have arrived precisely to drop the curtain on his little performance." She reached for a sleek satellite phone, her eyes never leaving the house. The tension in the armored box of the limousine was unbearable. The world I thought I knew, the world where my father held the power and I held the blame, was crumbling into frozen dust. The real lesson wasn't about respect. It was about the architecture of power. And Eleanor had just handed me the blueprints. Eleanor flicked a small, highly focused reading light above my head. It cast a sharp, sterile glow over the compartment, illuminating the deep indigo folder she now placed squarely on my trembling lap. "Before you decide what to do with the man currently toasting his success inside that oversized birdcage," she said, her tone level and businesslike, "you need the full context of tonight's transaction." The folder was dense, weighted with paper, the tangible, irrefutable proof of financial betrayal. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cover, still fighting the lifetime conditioning that told me challenging my father was dangerous. Eleanor simply gave an impatient flick of her wrist. I opened it. The first page was a summary sheet, starkly titled, "Kingsley Holdings, Internal Fraud Report Concerning Daniel Lawson." My eyes scanned the bullet points. Unauthorized wire transfers to offshore entities, proxy account misappropriation, falsification of trustee signatures. It detailed years of slow, methodical bleeding of the trust that was supposed to be safeguarding my future. It wasn't just Daniel being a bad dad. He was a dedicated thief. I flipped to the next document. It was a printed email chain, dated roughly 5 months prior. It was between Daniel Lawson and the CEO of a rival cybersecurity firm, Nova Shield Systems. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. A dull, panicked thud. Attached to Daniel's outgoing message was a file. Core Cipher v3.2. Zip. Core Cipher. That was the trade secret level, proprietary algorithm at the heart of my startup. CipherNest. It was my blood, sweat, and thousands of hours of coding. The body of Daniel's email was short and brutal. He identified himself as my silent, controlling representative and offered to sell the complete and exclusive usage rights to my entire codebase for a flat fee of $2.8 million. The final, nauseating sentence sealed the deal. Daniel specifically required that Nova Shield Systems launch its competing product 2 weeks ahead of CipherNest's scheduled public debut. The goal, explicitly stated, was to crush market confidence and ensure the elimination of the competing entity. The air left my lungs, the timeline. It clicked into place with horrifying clarity. That email's date matched the exact week my lead institutional investor had suddenly and inexplicably pulled their funding. And the launch date Nova Shield had just used to bury me? It was exactly the time Daniel had dictated. My startup hadn't failed due to market forces or poor execution. It had been professionally murdered by the one person I thought was my anchor. I remembered the days I'd spent sobbing, poring over balance sheets, trying to find the structural weakness. All the while, the weakness wasn't in the code. It was in my own home, dressed in a tailored suit. The subsequent pages laid out the trail of the $2.8 million. It wasn't invested. It was liquidated. The funds were instantly routed through 3 different offshore accounts and used to cover Daniel's staggering gambling debts. A significant chunk went toward the down payment on a super yacht he and Miranda had been bragging about last summer. The rest was used to pay off a substantial bridge loan taken out in Miranda's name, likely to keep her happy and compliant. My intellectual property, my professional future, had been converted into a series of expensive props for Daniel's ongoing performance of success. I looked up at Eleanor, unable to speak. The betrayal, a physical, choking sensation in my throat. Eleanor, impassive, continued the disclosure. When I realized what Daniel was doing, not just to you, but to the Kingsley name and legacy, I acted. She calmly admitted that she hadn't been idle during her supposed death. She had been operating the entire time. Nova Shield Systems? She asked rhetorically. I bought it, secretly, through a shell company headquartered in Luxembourg. I acquired it just before the acquisition that was going to make them public. It cost me $720 million to take control of an entire company just to recover your code and ensure Daniel Lawson got precisely 0.00% of the long-term profits. She then pointed to another document, a legal declaration from a different state, one that detailed a complex, and apparently very expensive, declaration of legal death. I wasn't physically dead, Aaliyah. I was legally deceased, Eleanor stated. It was necessary. I discovered Daniel's initial, far more insidious plan to gradually liquidate and pillage Kingsley Holdings by exploiting a loophole related to spousal inheritance. I had to disappear, to become a ghost in the system, to protect the actual assets and, more importantly, to observe. Your father assumed my absence meant he could move without constraint. He got greedy. He betrayed you, his only child, for less than $3 million to cover his poker losses. The irony, Aaliyah, is almost Shakespearean. Eleanor picked up the heavy folder, her eyes finally meeting mine, demanding acknowledgement of this new, terrifying reality. Cipher Nest is still alive, she announced. It's nestled safely under my corporate umbrella, and all ownership rights are back where they belong, with you. This betrayal, this failure you came home to, was merely the price of entry into the real fight. She snapped the folder shut, the sound loud and definitive in the small space. Tonight, you are here not as the victim of a failed company. You are here because you are the legal and intellectual owner of every asset Daniel Lawson touches. The only question left is, what title do you wish to wear when you walk back into that house? Do you re-enter as the bankrupt victim who was thrown out onto the ice? Or do you step through that door as the new, undisputed CEO of everything? The choice was a lightning bolt of sheer, intoxicating power. The cold was still there, but now it felt external, something I could fight, something I could control. The internal chill of feeling worthless, of being a failure, had been burned away by the white-hot rage of a calculated financial assassination. Eleanor didn't wait for my full response to her question. Her eyes, cold and sharp as the Arctic air outside, were already on her task. She picked up the satellite phone, the one I'd seen her use earlier, and spoke a sequence of clipped, low commands. It's time for the environment to adjust. Cut the line to the main breaker. Yes, the one I installed. Confirm total isolation. The command felt surreal, like something pulled from a Hollywood heist film, but it made perfect sense. Before she was a shadowy, legally deceased billionaire. Eleanor Kingsley had been an industrial magnate, the founder of the power utility that had literally wired this entire suburb. She knew the infrastructure of the estate better than Daniel knew his own bank PIN. I watched, mesmerized, as the Grand Lawson residence performed a spectacular instant blackout. The massive crystal chandelier in the foyer, a piece Daniel constantly bragged about, went dark. The shimmering, 12-foot Christmas trees, hundreds of lights extinguished simultaneously. The rich, amber glow from the dining room vanished, replaced by a sudden, absolute void. The entire manor looked as if someone had pulled a giant plug from a cosmic socket. Inside the limo, the only light came from the dash and the reading lamp above me, leaving the house in dramatic contrast. Panic immediately erupted within the walls. Through the glass, I could see the frantic, disoriented motion. Daniel's silhouette was large and agitated, waving his arms, shouting instructions that were, thankfully, inaudible. Miranda, usually so composed, frantically hugged a tablecloth to her chest as if it were a shield. Chloe was a silhouette fumbling near a wall, undoubtedly searching for an outlet to charge her phone, her source of life support. Eleanor observed the chaos with the detachment of a scientist watching a petri dish. The reverse temperature lesson, she explained, her voice calm against the muffled shouts. Without power, the central gas furnace is disabled. This house is large and poorly insulated. Daniel only cared about the facade, not the efficiency. It will drop at least 10 degrees within the hour. By the time we're finished, the internal atmosphere will perfectly mirror the conditions Daniel just threw you into. As the family inside began to shiver and panic, A sudden, dramatic loss of their perceived control. I sat in the insulated warmth of the limousine. For the first time since Daniel pushed me out, I experienced the sensation of being on the other side of the glass. I wasn't the one suffering in the cold. I was the one controlling the switch. The cold was now working for me, an invisible, psychological weapon against those who had used it against me. The power shift was palpable, intoxicating. Just then, two figures emerged from the line of trees at the edge of the driveway, moving with the efficient purpose of trained operatives. They were tall men in severe, black overcoats, wearing earpieces and leather gloves. They approached the limo door, and Eleanor nodded a brief acknowledgement. "Aaliyah, this is Mr. Vane, my chief of security, and Mr. Holt, my lead internal counsel," she introduced. "They will be your support tonight. Mr. Holt is holding the legal documents that turn this evening from a melodrama into a hostile takeover." I shook their hands. Holt's was dry and firm. Vane's was thick and surprisingly gentle. Eleanor wasted no time on pleasantries. She launched into a rapid-fire strategic briefing. "This is not about revenge. Aaliyah, revenge is messy and leaves you vulnerable to countersuits. This is about legal execution. It is a hostile takeover. Pure and simple. We utilize the facts, Daniel's internal fraud, and his abandonment of a beneficiary in dangerous conditions. Your emotions are a secondary weapon. The primary weapons are the paperwork and the legally binding clauses. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," I managed, my voice stronger than it had been all night. "Documents, not feelings." "Good. Now, you must prepare the final line. It is not a plea. It is not a question. It is the unassailable declaration of a new owner." Eleanor made me repeat the words, focusing not on volume, but on the absolute certainty behind them. "Say it, Aaliyah. What is your final instruction?" I looked at the house, now just a giant, dark cube, a monument to a lifetime of manipulation. I thought of the -10 degrees Celsius on my skin an hour ago. I thought of the $2.8 million stolen from my startup. "I want them removed from my property," I stated, the words cold and steady. "Right now." Again, with zero uncertainty. "I want them removed from my property, effective immediately," I repeated, the power of the ownership settling over me. Eleanor smiled, a faint, predatory curve of the lips. It was the first time I had ever seen her express anything close to satisfaction. The limo's headlights remained on, twin beams cutting through the heavy snow, shining directly onto the grand facade of the dark mansion. The light made the house look like a stage set, empty and waiting. The heat inside was slowly, irrevocably, leaking out, leaving a hollow shell behind. This was the moment before the final curtain rose. We were no longer waiting outside. We were preparing to step onto the stage as the new directors, and the final scene was about to begin. The limousine engine went silent, but the twin headlights remained on, fiercely focused on the front entrance of the mansion, transforming the heavy oak door into a stage prop. I stepped out of the warmth, now wearing Eleanor's heavy wool coat, the thick fabric a comforting armor against the -10-degree night. I no longer felt the cold as a threat, but as an ally. Eleanor walked ahead of me, her stride purposeful and slow, followed by Mr. Vane, the chief of security, and Mr. Holt, the internal counsel. We weren't a family coming home for Christmas. We were an audit team arriving to seize assets. The front door, like every mechanism of control Daniel ever implemented, was locked. Vane didn't bother with the bell. He pulled a sleek, nondescript device from his coat pocket and inserted a thin filament into the lock mechanism. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible whirring sound, a series of precise clicks, and then the deadbolt retracted. Eleanor placed her hand on the cold brass knob. "This property is held by the trust, which is under my control," she announced, though only to us. "I have the right to enter my own home without invitation." She pushed the door open. A blast of frigid air rushed into the foyer, meeting the internal cold already settling in. The main hall was vast and black. smelling of stale fear and expensive wood. The only light came from the dining room, where several antique silver candle holders had been hastily lit. The flickering candlelight cast chaotic, dancing shadows, making the luxurious space feel haunted. The wind whistled faintly through the inadequate seals of the windows. In the dining room, the scene was one of disarray. Miranda and Chloe sat huddled, their faces pale and drawn in the guttering candlelight. Miranda's makeup looked stark and artificial. Chloe, for once, didn't look like a porcelain doll. She looked genuinely scared. Daniel stood near the head of the table, clutching a thick silver candelabra as if it were a medieval weapon. His initial reaction was primal, the same aggressive posturing he always used to establish dominance. "Who the hell are you?" he roared, his voice echoing in the cold, empty space. "I'm calling the police. This is my house. You are trespassing. Get out now." He tried to inflate his chest, to summon the intimidating authority that had always made me shrink as a child. But then, Eleanor walked into the circle of candlelight. She removed her leather gloves, one finger at a time, revealing the enormous diamond cluster ring she always wore. She looked directly at Daniel, and in that instant, his blustering rage died, strangled by absolute terror. The silver candelabra in his hand dropped slightly, rattling against the marble table. Daniel Lawson was staring at a ghost, his jaw sagged, his eyes wide and fixed. He didn't see Eleanor Kingsley, the woman who had died 3 years ago. He saw something far more terrifying, the judgment of his past. Eleanor didn't offer a dramatic explanation of her resurrection. Her single, chilling sentence was enough to dismantle his carefully constructed reality. "Sometimes, Daniel, to truly see who will bury you, you have to lie down for a little while." The implication was clear. She hadn't died. She had been watching. She knew everything about his financial and emotional larceny. Mr. Holt, stepping forward with the composure of a trial lawyer, cut through the silence. He didn't address the dead or alive question. He addressed the law. "Mr. Lawson, in the context of the Kingsley Trust, Section 6.17 pertains to the willful endangerment of a trust beneficiary's life. The act of locking Miss Perez outside in a -10°C temperature for an extended duration, coupled with the sudden power outage which removes immediate emergency recourse, constitutes potential criminal battery and reckless endangerment." He didn't raise his voice, but the word criminal echoed in the cold foyer. Daniel's face flushed crimson, the fear briefly replaced by indignant fury. "That was discipline. She was being disrespectful. She had to learn a lesson," he sputtered, clinging to his narrative of the wronged father. Miranda, seeing her husband's control crumble, rushed forward, her voice a desperate, trembling plea. "It's a misunderstanding. She's always been so sensitive. You know, he just wanted to teach her to be grateful. Aaliyah is just—" Holt silenced her with a polite but ironclad interruption, pulling out a printout and placing it gently on the table. "Mrs. Lawson, my brief includes testimony regarding the ambient temperature, the estimated duration of Miss Perez's exposure, approximately 57 minutes, the recorded wind chill factor, and photographic evidence from the exterior security cameras of Miss Perez showing signs of early-stage hypothermia. This is not a matter of subjective sensitivity. It is a matter of documented medical and legal negligence." The sheer reality of the evidence, the numbers, the camera proofs, crushed Miranda's emotional defense instantly. She retreated, her hand covering her mouth. Daniel, completely cornered, fell back on his ultimate authority, the last pillar of his illusion. He stabbed a finger at the floor. "This is my house," he shouted, the sound cracking slightly with desperation. "I built this life. I have the right to decide what happens within these 4 walls." Eleanor, standing still and quiet, watched him make his final, fatal mistake. He had just declared his absolute control over the walls, unwittingly paving the way for Holt to deliver the final, legal blow, the revelation that he never owned the walls in the first place. Daniel's final, desperate claim, "This is my house," was the precise opening Eleanor had been waiting for. She gave a curt nod to Mr. Holt, who immediately produced a large navy blue leather folio, heavier and more formal than the previous fraud report. Holt opened the folder with a sharp snap and drew out a sheaf of aged documents. Mr. Lawson's assertion of ownership requires examination, given the foundational documents of the Kingsley family holdings. He held up the original contract, dated nearly 30 years ago, well before Daniel had even married my late mother. It was the charter that established the entire framework of the family's wealth. Holt began to read, his voice clear and resonant in the cold, candlelit foyer. Section 4.1 explicitly designates Daniel Lawson as the temporary operating trustee. This designation was subject to a clear, non-negotiable condition. The entirety of the principal assets, including the main residence, all stock portfolios, and associated liquid accounts, will automatically transfer to the first direct female heir upon reaching the age of 26. A profound, sickening silence followed. The implication was immediate, devastating, and entirely transparent. Daniel started to shake his head violently, clinging to his lie. "That's invalid. I bought this house. I transferred the deed. I have the paperwork from 2020. This is ancient history." Holt didn't argue. He merely countered with fact. He gestured to another document in the folio. "The documents you refer to, Mr. Lawson, are not a transference of ownership. They are long-term lease agreements. Your wife, the late Mrs. Lawson, ensured that the house was leased back to you from the holding company. You have been a tenant, not an owner. Your right of residency was conditional and entirely predicated on your role as the temporary trustee for the future owner." The truth slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The date, the effective date of the transfer. Holt continued, pointing a long finger at the contract's signature line. The activation clause, 7.2, dictated that the transfer became legally effective at 0001 hours on the beneficiary's 26th birthday. My birthday, my 26th birthday. I remembered that week vividly. It was the week my startup, Cipher Nest, had utterly collapsed. I had spent that day alone in a cheap hotel room, mourning the loss of my company, believing I was a failure, and flying home in shame to face Daniel's smug judgment. The moment I turned 26, the house, the money, the power, it all silently, legally became mine, and Daniel, the supposed king, was unaware that he was presiding over a castle that no longer belonged to him. Eleanor stepped forward, her expression chillingly calm. She was holding court. "I didn't intervene because I had to know," she stated, speaking only to Daniel, her voice low and dangerous. "I had to know how you would treat the future actual owner of the empire. I watched as you spent 3 months belittling her, crushing her, and culminating in tonight's act of locking the new legal owner out on the stone patio to suffer a lesson in humility. You failed the final test. Daniel, the temperature you controlled has been turned against you. Mr. Holt brought the legal finality. Therefore, Mr. Lawson, as of 7 months ago, when Miss Perez turned 26, your residency status transitioned from that of a temporary trustee to, effectively, an at-will resident with oral permission to occupy. You hold no ownership claim, no legal benefit, and no administrative power within the Kingsley family holdings." Miranda and Chloe finally understood the gravity of the situation. They hadn't just lost their status, they had lost their entire foundation. Their faces went from pale fear to outright horror as Holt added one final detail. Furthermore, Mrs. Lawson and Miss Chloe, the extensive credit card lines, the luxury vehicles, and all expenditures made through the holdings funds over the past 2 years were dependent on Mr. Lawson's temporary trustee access. As you were never legal beneficiaries, your access to those funds, and the legal ownership of any assets acquired with them, is now highly questionable. Their entire lavish lifestyle, their clothes, their cars, the perfect Christmas, had just dissolved into a pile of fraudulent transactions. Holt turned to me, the blue folder still open on the antique table. His expression was serious, respectful. He was addressing an equal, a client, a CEO. "Miss Aaliyah Perez?" he asked, his voice ringing slightly in the cold, dark room. "Do you accept the position of rightful legal owner of this residence and its associated assets, as per Section 7.2 of this trust agreement?" I took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. The shock of the betrayal, the sudden realization of my own power, the weight of the trust, it all converged. I looked at Daniel, who stood paralyzed, his eyes desperately searching for a loophole, a lie, a way back to control. My eyes, which had been red and tearful just an hour ago, were now dry and hard. I spoke the word that ripped the last thread of Daniel's authority. "Yes." The declaration was quiet, but absolute. Daniel Lawson, his face contorted in a silent scream of disbelief, let go of the silver candelabra. It hit the marble floor with a deafening metallic clang. The small flame of the candle flickered wildly in the cold air, briefly illuminating his face. Exposed, stripped of his mask, finally and completely out of control, the candelabra lay on the cold marble floor, the flames still struggling against the draft. Daniel's face, for the first time, wasn't a mask of control. It was a grotesque picture of pure, naked fear and incomprehension. But as quickly as the shock hit, his narcissistic survival instincts kicked in, triggering the predictable tactical shift. He abandoned the role of the roaring tyrant and instantly adopted the mantle of the poor, wronged father. "Aaliyah," he pleaded, his voice cracking, dripping with forced emotion. He tried to take a step toward me, arms outstretched in a weak gesture of paternal comfort. "Sweetheart, you can't possibly mean this. Your grandmother is manipulating you. Don't let her destroy our family. After everything I've done for you, the tuition, the private schools, the late nights I stayed up worrying about your future, you owe me this much. Aaliyah, you owe me." It was the same emotional script he had used since I was a child. The narrative of my immense, unforgivable debt to him. But tonight, the script was failing. I looked at his outstretched hand and didn't feel guilt. I felt the crisp clarity of the email in the navy blue folder, the one where he sold my intellectual property for $2.8 million to cover his losses. I remembered the endless, freezing nights I'd spent sleeping on the couch at the Cipher Nest office, fueled by instant coffee and sheer ambition, believing I was building my own future. His worrying nights were spent either at the poker table or forging a deal to betray me. I stepped back, putting distance between us. "I don't owe you anything, Daniel, and I am done paying." I turned my attention to Miranda, who was silently weeping, the perfect damsel in distress. "Miranda," I said, using her first name, cutting off her pretense of being a maternal figure. "Tell me again about the time I had to put concealer over the stress hives on my neck before the Christmas family photo. You said it was because the redness ruined the clean Instagram feed. You weren't worried about my health. You were worried about the aesthetic of your performance." Miranda's weeping instantly stalled, replaced by a defensive glare. "That's unfair. I was trying to make sure you looked your best. It was for the family album." "It was for your followers," I corrected, my voice calm but devastatingly final. "You used me to validate your status as the perfect stepmother, a role you never once intended to fulfill." Then came Chloe. She had retreated behind Miranda, her usual angelic face contorted into something tight and resentful. "And you, Chloe," I continued, not bothering to lower my voice. "You didn't just steal my presentation ideas for your own credit. You specifically edited my slide deck before I was supposed to present it to Daniel, making my data look inconsistent, just so he would humiliate me in front of the board. And then you stood there, smiling, when he called me an embarrassing liability." Chloe started to stammer. "That's a lie. I was helping you. I was just—" "You were securing your spot," I finished for her. "You were ensuring I was always the flawed one, so your manufactured perfection would shine brighter. I saw the pictures you took of my cardboard boxes when I arrived here. You called it gothic poverty chic to your friends. You were feeding on my failure." I recalled Daniel's actions from the previous 3 days, calling my failure the smell of trash in his house. Miranda openly discussing with her friend on speakerphone the wisdom of renting me a cheap, far-flung apartment to keep me out of sight. They hadn't just been mean, they had been cruel, celebratory architects of my misery. Daniel made one last attempt, reaching out to grasp my arm, his voice a low, desperate plea. "Aaliyah, please, we can fix this. You're our daughter. I love you." I pulled my arm away sharply, recoiling from the touch. "Don't touch me," I said, the revulsion genuine. "That hand, the one that's trying to hold my arm right now, that hand signed the email that sold the 3 years of my life's work for less than $3 million. You didn't just fail me as a father. You committed fraud against me as a business partner. There is no father-daughter relationship left to save. Daniel, there is only a business dissolution." Eleanor, who had remained silent and still in the shadow of the staircase, gave a barely perceptible nod of approval. She had let me fight my own battles, armed with the truth. "You do not owe them courtesy they never afforded you." Eleanor's soft voice cut through the silence, a final reminder that I was no longer the child seeking approval. I looked at the three of them, Daniel, Miranda, Chloe. They were trapped, not by the cold, but by the collapse of their own carefully constructed lies. In my heart, there was a pinprick of sadness, a tiny residual hope that one of them would break character, admit their cruelty, and offer a genuine apology. But all I received was the chorus of their denial. "You misunderstand. We only wanted the best for you. You're just overreacting." That was their ending. They would die clinging to the illusion of their own innocence. Mr. Holt stepped forward, bringing the confrontation back to the cold. Undeniable law. He looked directly at me, the new owner of the property. "Miss Perez?" he asked, his voice firm and formal. "In your official capacity as the legal owner of this residence and its associated assets, how do you intend to proceed with the removal of these unauthorized residents?" Every head in the room, Eleanor, Vane, Miranda, Chloe, and Daniel, snapped to look at me, the focus now entirely on my final verdict. The fate of their entire life was now resting on my answer, and the only sound was the faint hiss of the wind through the eaves of the dark, cold house. Mr. Holt's question hung in the freezing air, the final, crucial pivot point of the evening. All eyes were on me, the supposed victim who now held the executioner's gavel. Daniel, Miranda, and Chloe were holding their breath, their panic palpable, their futures balanced precariously on my decision. My mind instantly flashed back to the patio. I recalled the desperate, raw cold, the way the terror of actual death had made my bones ache, Daniel's dismissal, his cruel instruction to think about your attitude for 5 minutes, which stretched into nearly an hour while inside. The family laughed, drank, and toasted a perfect, warm Christmas. Not one of them had checked, not one. A dark, intoxicating thought surfaced. The purest form of revenge. Reciprocity. I could lock all their expensive coats in a closet. I could leave the power off, letting the internal temperature of the massive, poorly insulated house drop quickly into the low single digits. I could make them experience the exact same -10 degrees Celsius dread, but this time, surrounded by their useless wealth, the symmetry was perfect, the retribution deeply satisfying. But running parallel to that surge of vindictive justice was a quieter, harder voice. The voice I had spent 26 years trying to cultivate, the one Daniel had always tried to suffocate with guilt and mockery. If I become Daniel, but with more power and better paperwork, have I truly won? Am I free? Or have I merely swapped roles, trading the identity of the victim for the identity of the tormentor? Daniel, ever the opportunist, sensed the flicker of internal conflict, the pause that signaled negotiation was possible. He leapt into the gap, discarding the pathetic father role for the quick-thinking business partner. "Aaliyah, sweetheart, listen to reason," he said, his voice dropping to a frantic, confidential tone. "We can make a deal. I will sign over all remaining operational control of the family firm. I will personally restructure CipherNest for you. I know the right contacts. I'll even release a statement to the Wall Street Journal, apologizing for my oversight and praising your talent. Just don't be excessive. Don't do anything you can't walk back from." He was trying to buy his way back in with favors and promises. Miranda immediately transitioned to the abject victim. Her tears returned, but this time they were accompanied by a frantic, self-serving confession. She spoke of her own impoverished childhood, the fear of ending up back in the gutter. "I never hated you. Aaliyah, I swear," she pleaded, wringing her hands. "I was just so scared of being poor again that I clung to Daniel. I didn't know how to be close to his daughter, how to be your stepmother. I was just surviving." The apology was hollow, an excuse designed to elicit pity and minimize her active role in my abuse. Chloe, however, went straight for the jugular, choosing contempt over contrition. She didn't apologize. She challenged. She forced a harsh, ugly laugh. "Are you really going to throw your whole family out into a snowstorm just to prove a point?" she sneered, her mask completely gone. "Successful people don't act this small. Aaliyah, real CEOs are too busy building their empires to obsess over petty old grudges." Her words, small, petty, old grudges, were intended to shrink my victory, to force me back into the defensive position. I closed my eyes, the scene a frozen tableau in the cold, dark foyer. I could visualize the alternative, opening my mouth and saying, "Stay, but under my terms." I saw the future instantly. Daniel would plot, Miranda would feign devotion, and Chloe would undermine with greater subtlety. They wouldn't be grateful tenants. They would be sophisticated parasites, feeding on my guilt and my proximity, turning the house into a more polished version of the hell I had just escaped. True freedom was impossible with them under my roof. Eleanor, sensing the intense internal wrestling, offered a final, guiding thought. She didn't command. She merely defined. "A house is not just walls and a roof. Aaliyah, it is the people you allow to cross the threshold. Tonight, you are deciding who deserves access to your life for the next 10 years. Choose the people who build your empire, not the ones who try to burn it for warmth." I opened my eyes. I looked past the desperate faces, past the shame, past the silver candelabra on the floor. I looked directly at Mr. Holt, the lawyer who held the mechanism of my freedom. The decision was not about punishing them for the cold. It was about ensuring my own warmth, permanently. "I want to act," I told him, the words steady and clear, carrying the full weight of the ownership. "But I want to do it in a way that, when I look back tomorrow, I don't see a more sophisticated version of the very person who threw me out on the ice." The question of how, the specific mechanism of my revenge, hung in the air, delaying the final confrontation and ensuring that the last act would be definitive, measured, and entirely mine. The cold foyer held the final tension, silent save for Daniel's heavy, panicked breathing. I looked at Mr. Holt, confirming my decision to choose clarity over cruelty. "Mr. Holt," I stated, my voice echoing the authority I now wielded. "Please read the specific rights of the owner regarding the immediate cessation of tenancy." Mr. Holt, ever professional, drew a new document from his file, a simple addendum to the main trust. "As legal owner, Ms. Perez retains the right to terminate any at-will residency agreement, effective immediately, particularly under conditions where the resident has demonstrated gross negligence or willfully placed the owner's life in severe and documented danger. This termination is non-negotiable and requires immediate compliance." I stepped forward, moving away from Eleanor's shadow and into the dim candlelight, facing the three figures who had spent my life diminishing me. "The at-will residency agreement is terminated for Daniel Lawson, Miranda Lawson, and Chloe Lawson, effective right now," I announced. "You have no further claim, access, or right to be inside this property. You will be escorted out by Mr. Vane and his team." Daniel erupted. "You can't! It's a blizzard outside. It's -10 degrees. You're putting us in danger. He was screaming the accusation he knew would hurt the most, trying to weaponize the weather. I met his gaze, my expression completely flat. The back patio was also in a blizzard, Daniel, and it was -10 degrees when you left me out there for nearly an hour. Celebrating inside, you chose not to check on me. You saw the danger, and you allowed it to continue. I am, however, being far kinder. You are allowed to take the clothes on your back, and Miranda, you and Chloe may each take one small handbag. You will leave all other possessions. The assets are subject to a full audit and forfeiture pending the investigation into the $2.8 million fraud. The immediate shock turned to grasping self-interest. Daniel, realizing his pleas were useless, frantically tried to shove his large gold watch off his wrist. Fine, I'll take this. It's mine. It was a gift. Mr. Vane, moving with professional speed, placed a hand firmly on Daniel's arm. Mr. Lawson, you may not remove any personal jewelry or effects, only the clothes you are currently wearing. Miranda, her face a mask of avarice, started blindly scrambling toward the hall table where her enormous diamond engagement ring usually sat. My jewelry! I bought that! That was mine! She shrieked, her earlier performance of the quiet, suffering wife forgotten in the face of material loss. I spoke, my voice low but cutting through the noise. Miranda, everything you acquired in the last 3 years, including that ring, was purchased with funds derived from the Kingsley Holding Trust, funds you were never a legal beneficiary of. It stays here for the forensic accounting team. She collapsed back against the wall, whimpering. I looked at her, truly seeing the fear beneath the veneer. The only thing I cannot take back from you, Miranda, is the emotional youth I wasted trying to get your approval. You lose the possessions. I lost the time. We are now even. Chloe, pale but defiant, was clinging tightly to the new, expensive handbag Daniel had given her earlier that evening, a symbol of her replacement of me at the dinner table. This is mine, Chloe insisted, holding the leather close. He bought this tonight. It's new. That handbag was purchased using the credit card account linked to the money Daniel received for selling my code, I said, pointing directly at the bag. It is evidence of theft and fraud. You are not keeping it. A tug-of-war ensued between the angry 24-year-old and the unyielding security expert. After a brief struggle, Chloe let out a frustrated cry and hurled the designer bag onto the cold stone floor, stomping her foot in impotent rage. Vane and his second guard efficiently ushered the three toward the front door. The wind howled against the heavy oak, threatening to tear it from its hinges. The sight of them, flanked by silent security men, disheveled, defeated, walking into the dark, was the mirror image of my own journey just 1 hour ago. The only difference was that my hand was now firmly on the lock. Daniel stopped at the threshold, turning to look back at the dark house, his expression a mixture of hatred and utter devastation. You'll regret this. Aaliyah, you don't know how to run this place. You don't know how the world works. You'll be back begging on your knees within 6 months, he spat. I didn't dignify his threat with an argument. I simply offered the final distinction between us, the boundary that separated justice from sadism. I reached behind the door and pulled 3 old, thin, synthetic rain jackets from a coat rack. Not the thick wool coat Eleanor had given me, but something barely better than nothing. I tossed them onto the stone doorstep. I don't want anyone to freeze to death on my property, I said, looking not at Daniel, but at the dark, swirling snow. I am not you, Daniel. I am not cruel. I simply require that the 3 of you leave my life's path. Take those. You are dismissed. I met his furious, pathetic gaze one last time, feeling nothing but a cool, clear resolve. I know how to write the code to protect the system, I responded. As of tonight, that system is my life, and you. I paused, letting the finality sink in. Have no further access. I slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the new lock Vane had installed just hours earlier. The click of the deadbolt was the sound of a chapter closing. A lifetime of manipulation finally sealed out. Eleanor walked over, a faint, almost maternal smile gracing her lips, a complex expression of pride and grim approval. She made a quick call to the team waiting down the road. "Restore power, full thermal capacity, immediately." The darkness of the foyer vanished instantly. The crystal chandelier flared to life, casting brilliant, warm light everywhere. The house, which had been a cold, silent tomb for the last hour, suddenly began to hum. The sound of the gas furnace roaring back to life was a deep, satisfying bass note. I felt the surge of hot air pouring out of the ceiling vents, wrapping around me, chasing away the last vestiges of the night's chill. I stood in the center of the brightly lit hall, the true owner of the walls, the lights, and the temperature. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and unequivocally warm, knowing that I was the one who decided who got to stay in the light and who had to face the storm. I had chosen myself. Thank you so much for listening to Aaliyah's story tonight. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing our community grow. If you love this tale of chilling revenge and financial freedom, please hit that like button. Subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories for more real-life dramas. And don't forget to smash the hype button to make sure this story is heard by even more people.